Hello, everyone, and welcome. On behalf of the Center for a New American Security, I just wanted to welcome everyone and thank you for taking the time to join us today. And of course, a special thanks to our three guests. I'm Andrea Kendall-Taylor, and I'm really pleased to moderate today's discussion. I would say that Washington, D.C. really is abuzz in anticipation of all of the upcoming summits in what has really become an incredible lineup of diplomatic engagements for President Biden's first international trip. Of course, we're starting with the G7 and then moving on to the NATO and EU summits, and then the meeting between President Biden and Russian President Putin. As a transatlanticist, I would say that I was really pleased to see that President Biden is headed to Europe for his first trip. I think it's just an incredible signal of the importance of Europe and the importance of European allies and partners. When you look across all of the summits, there really is an incredible number of issues on the table, a tremendous amount of ground to be covered. I expect all of our panelists will talk quite a lot about what they're calling the 3 Cs, COVID, climate, and China. But there's also technology issues. There's all of the challenges that Russia is presenting to the alliance, issues and threats and challenges to democracy. So there's an incredible amount of ground to be covered. I would say from the outside, many of us are looking to these summits as an important signal of the tone and the contours of U.S. relations with Europe, as a signal of what we can expect to accomplish with like-minded allies and partners. And of course, looking to see where we might be headed in the U.S. relationship with Russia. And so to help us make sense of all of this, I'm really just so thrilled to be able to welcome all three guests, 3 members of President Biden's National Security Council. So I want to just very briefly, so we can make good use of our hour, just very briefly introduce all 3 of them. We'll start in the center with Daleep Singh, who is the Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor. We're also joined by Dr. Amanda Sloat, who is Senior Advisor to the President and NSC Senior Director for Europe. And also Eric Green, who is Senior Advisor to the President and Senior Director for Russia and Central Asia. So again, welcome to all of you, and thanks so much for taking the time in what I know is an incredibly busy time for all of you. Like I said, I want to make very good use of our time, and so what I thought I would do is just turn it over to the 3 of you to maybe start with a couple of opening remarks, lay out what you see President Biden's priorities are for the summit, your expectations for the summit. And I thought we could maybe go in order of the summit. So Daleep, maybe starting with the G7, hand it over to you, and then we'll move on to Amanda and Eric. But so Daleep, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. Thanks for everybody for joining this session. So, the G7 is back in a literal sense for the first time in almost 2 years. But more importantly, it's back in the sense that we're unified. We're unified in terms of our resolve to show as democracies and with our shared democratic values that we can deliver results for our people and that we can meet the world's biggest challenges. Our focus will be on what we're for, but we'll also be clear on what we won't tolerate. And we'll do so with self-confidence, in defense of the shared values that forge the G7's partnership. Freedom, opportunity, rule of law, the dignity of all people. And so I'm happy to say that America is once again rallying the world's democracies into action from a position of strength as we head into these meetings. And of course, no challenge requires action more so than the pandemic. On his first day in office, President Biden marshaled a whole of government wartime effort to defeat the pandemic. And since that point, COVID cases are down over 90%, deaths are down over 85%, and millions of Americans are living their lives again. And so now that we have enough vaccine supply for all Americans, we're in a position to help, and so we will. It's the right thing to do, and it will save lives. So we'll work with our G7 partners on a larger multilateral effort to help end the pandemic across the world. That could involve vaccines. It could involve addressing constraints on raw materials, manufacturing, production, distribution, storage, and also working together to help prepare for future threats. And we'll do all of this without strings attached, without conditions, and with the sole purpose of trying to save lives. We'll have more to say about all of this next week when the leaders gather in the UK. On the global economy, Andrea, here again, the United States is heading into the G7 from a position of strength. And this is quite a turnaround from when we took office 4 months ago. If you remember, on January 20, the US and the global economy were in a deep hole. But by turning the tide on the pandemic and by making a deliberate choice to deliver big and upfront fiscal support, coupled with plans to make generational investments to address structural challenges, the economy is recovering strongly. Last week, the OECD increased their projection of the full year US growth projection for 2021 to 6.9%. And if that's realized, that would be the fastest pace of growth in almost 4 decades. Before we took office, if you recall, independent experts had projected that US growth would be in the range of 3 to 4% this year. The labor market, too, has been gathering strength since the president took office. The US economy has added over 500,000 jobs per month on average, and the IMF forecasts that the US will return to the pre-pandemic unemployment rate by 2023, which is almost 7 years faster than the recovery to full employment after 2009. And so we're urging our G7 partners to join us in continuing to provide near-term fiscal support to create a balanced global recovery and long-term structural investments to boost our innovation and our dynamism as a partnership. We can also work with our finance track colleagues to explore ways to channel support to low-income countries where the pandemic response needs are the greatest and where the economic recovery has been slowest. In addition, we'll continue to work through the G7 to signal unity in our strong push to lift the global minimum tax for corporations, to end the race to the bottom on tax competition, and also to provide resources to fund our respective domestic renewals and to reduce the burden on labor to generate tax revenues. When we talk about the G7 being unified, of course, this also applies to the broader geopolitical competition. And here again, the G7 partnership is forged by the shared values of democratic countries and open societies. And these are the values, as the president has said, that define our way of life and what we deliver to our people. And right now, as he's mentioned many times before, democratic values are being challenged. We're in the midst of a debate between those who've argued that autocracy is the best path forward and those who believe, like we do, that democracy is the single best path to delivering results. And so as we come together as a G7, we will look for ways to advance a positive and self-confident agenda that follows from those shared values. I think I'll pause there and hand it over to my colleagues, and happy to take any questions afterwards, Andrea.
Wonderful. Thanks for that, Daleep. And so Amanda, maybe we'll come to you if you want to kind of say something similar, kind of tee up what you see as the big priorities are for the Nato and the EU summits. As I've heard you say, it's the first one since 2014 with the EU summit. And so, a lot of symbolism and importance there. So just would love to hear your thoughts on key priorities going into those 2 summits.
Great. Thank you to Andrea and to CNAS for hosting this event, and to so many people that have tuned in. All of us here are certainly very excited about the president's trip. The president himself is very excited to get back on the road again. And the president certainly is a true transatlanticist, having worked on all of these European issues for decades, going back to his time in the Senate. And I think it's no surprise that the president's first trip is to Europe, with a very strong message that America is back to work in partnership with our closest allies, our friends, and our partners on the full range of global challenges that we are facing. As Andrea mentioned, there is a key theme of the 3 Cs across a lot of what we're going to see next week. Including COVID, climate, and China. We certainly could add additional Cs in terms of cyber threats, corruption, and much, much more. And as Daleep said, there is a very strong belief that the United States is most effective when we are working in close cooperation with our partners. And we really have no stronger allies and partners than those in Europe. To Andrea's point, we are not just going to be looking at 2 additional summits beyond the G7 with NATO and the EU. But as you will have seen in the updated trip announcement that the White House put out yesterday, the president is also going to be meeting with Boris Johnson on his first day when he arrives in Europe in advance of the G7. As he prepares to leave the UK, he will have the opportunity to meet with Queen Elizabeth, On the margins of the NATO summit, he will be meeting with the Turkish President Erdogan. He will also be meeting with the Belgian King, the Belgian Prime Minister, and he will be meeting with the Swiss President and the Swiss Foreign Minister. So really, it's going to be about a year's worth of diplomacy packed into one very busy week in Europe, where we'll have the opportunity to reaffirm our commitment to revitalizing and really raising the ambition of our partnership with Europeans across the continent. So let me say a brief word about the NATO summit. As Andrea, I think, mentioned, this is the first summit that NATO will have had since 2018. And there will be a communique coming out of this summit that is going to reaffirm the alliance's shared values, commitments, and our shared approach to a large number of common threats. President Biden is going to reaffirm, as he has done on several occasions in the last couple of months, America's very strong commitment to the NATO alliance, as well as our steadfast commitment to Article 5 and its security guarantees. This summit is going to provide a good opportunity for allies to begin taking stock of the alliance, where things stand, and what we need to do going forward to ensure that we are appropriately postured to meet both the current threats as well as new and emerging threats. Russia obviously is going to be a centerpiece of this discussion, and the alliance is going to reaffirm NATO's core mission of deterrence and defense, including against some of Russia's aggressive and destabilizing behavior, including some of which we have seen in the region in recent months. There's also at the same time the importance for the alliance to take action to ensure that it is appropriately postured to deal with newer threats. China is one of those, and I think the leaders are going to be taking stock of the need to adapt to the strategic challenge that Beijing poses to our collective security, prosperity, and values. Cybersecurity is another area that we are seeing increasing focus within the alliance on in terms of strengthening NATO's political, military, and technical efforts against the full range of cyber threats. And finally, there is climate and a recognition that we need the alliance, as we are doing here at home, as our European partners are doing, to understand how to adapt the alliance to the impact that climate change is having on security. And a final word on the NATO summit is Afghanistan. Everybody knows that it was 20 years ago that the alliance took the decision to go in together. And this year, the alliance has taken the decision to go out together. And so certainly the president and the alliance will be marking this and starting to discuss how NATO is shifting to a new chapter in our relationship with Afghanistan in terms of the civilian partnership and our continued support for Afghanistan, the people, and the peace process there. So let me say a few words about the U.S. EU Summit as well. By our accounting, this is the first summit that has been held since 2014. There was a brief leaders meeting in 2016. And we really see this as an opportunity to rebuild our relationship with the European Union, and more importantly, to raise the level of ambition in our partnership with the EU to commit to working together on a large number of shared interests. Notably, the US and the EU are home to 780 million people with shared democratic values and the largest economic relationship in the world. So there truly is no better partner for the United States when it comes to the full range of challenges. Together, our countries laid the foundations of the world economy after World War II. We wrote the rules of the road based on shared democratic values, on fair competition, and on transparency. And as with NATO taking a fresh look at the security challenges, it's also time for the US and the EU to take a look at updating these rules. We need to update these rules to protect our health, as we've seen over the last year with COVID. We need to update these rules to protect our climate, with the US taking a lot of steps in recent months to rejoin the Paris Agreement and to ensure that we are continuing to work in lockstep with our European allies who have been doing excellent work over the last number of years on the climate challenge, and also to ensure that technology improves all of our lives. The United States government, the Biden administration, welcomed the document that the EU launched in December 2020, calling for a new forward-looking transatlantic agenda. And we have been working in the last number of months with our EU partners to try and put into place a number of the excellent ideas that they had in that document. And this summit is going to be an excellent opportunity for President Biden to meet with Presidents von der Leyen and President Michel to talk about how we can continue to take some of those initiatives forward. I would expect that leaders coming out of this are going to be looking to develop an affirmative agenda on cooperation on a wide range of issues. They will be looking to strengthen our trade, investment, and technology cooperation. They will be looking at ways where we can fight the pandemic together, including driving a sustainable economic recovery for all of our countries. They will discuss the importance of protecting the planet and fostering green new growth. And they will also look at ways that we can work in partnership on building a stronger, more democratic and peaceful world. The United States remains committed to working in lockstep with our European allies on a number of foreign policy challenges, as we have seen over the last couple of months, for example, in terms of our joint actions on sanctions vis-a-vis China, Russia and other areas, Burma, where we have been able to partner. The last thing I will say is we're certainly also going to be continuing to discuss some areas, including on trade, where we haven't seen eye to eye. And I really think there is a good news story from the last couple of months about the progress that we've already been able to make in the early days of the administration toward taking steps to resolve some of these differences. This includes starting an important dialogue with the EU to address the steel and aluminum tariffs, as well as to see our negotiators continue to make progress to resolve the differences that we've had on Boeing and Airbus. So I really think there's a rich agenda for these two summits. And Andrea, if you want to come back and talk later in questions on some of the bilateral meetings, we can do that as well. But let me stop for now.
Fantastic. Thanks. And as I opened up, there is a tremendous amount of ground to cover. So we'll come back and pull a couple of these threads. But Eric, just want to come over to you. Last but certainly not least, some of your thoughts ahead of the much awaited Biden-Putin meeting and some of your policy priorities and thinking going into that summit.
Great. Thank you, Andrea. And it's great to be with everyone today. Let me first talk a little bit about how we're approaching Russia, and then I can say a few words about the summit itself. First of all, I think we've shown that we can and will respond to Russia's harmful actions, and we demonstrated this a few months ago in dealing with several issues, including Russia's use of chemical weapons, its election meddling, and cyber intrusions. Second, we are also going to be clear about standing up for our core values. We've done this in the case of Alexei Navalny and the use of chemical weapons, as well as the steps that Russia is taking against independent media, including Radio Liberty. Russian citizens, like individuals everywhere, should be able to exercise fundamental rights of freedom of expression and freedom of assembly. Third, the administration is willing to cooperate when it is in our interests. Our two countries have the largest nuclear arsenals on the planet, and that vests us with profound responsibilities. The Biden administration takes that seriously, as we demonstrated by extending the New START treaty by 5 years during our very first days in office. And fourth, we are really committed to coordinating and consulting closely with our allies and partners. This is really a force multiplier in our relations with Russia. And we have been united in calling out Russia's destabilizing activities, and we remain united on the core challenges that Russia poses to European security, starting with its aggression in Ukraine. In terms of the summit, we should remember that on the first page of the President's interim national security guidance, that guidance talks about the United States establishing a leadership role through diplomacy. This meeting with Putin is a prime example of that. Our goal is to restore predictability and stability in the relationship. We believe there's no substitute for leader-to-leader engagement, particularly in a relationship that is as complex as this. And we believe we need to have really clear lines of communication, starting at the presidential level, and we have to try to understand what Moscow's positions are. The agenda will really cover the waterfront. One area where we have some common ground is on strategic stability. I mentioned the extension of the New START treaty, which was generally a smooth process with Russia. Now we are in a position to enter a new phase, and the first step in this is to begin a high-level dialogue on core security challenges. This will have a number of goals, including to exchange information on threat perception, discuss risk reduction options, and explore possibilities for future arms control arrangements. When we talk about strategic stability, cyber will also certainly be on the agenda. The recent ransomware attacks remind us that the cyber domain is prone to misperceptions and that there are dangerous escalation risks. The president's first responsibility is to protect American citizens, and the Russian government is holding some of our citizens wrongfully, so we will be advocating on their behalf. We will also be discussing the restrictions that Russia has imposed on our diplomatic platform inside of Russia. Other topics on the agenda will include Iran, North Korea, Syria, Afghanistan, the Arctic, and climate change. The president will also reaffirm our commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and we'll talk about Belarus and the need to uphold norms of civil aviation, which we've seen grossly violated in recent weeks. So I think we've tried through the first days of the administration and President Biden's phone calls with President Putin to establish clearly what our goals are, what our intentions are, and this summit offers another opportunity to reinforce our interest in predictability and stability in this relationship. So I'll leave it there, Andrea, and turn it back to you.
Wonderful. And thanks again to all three of you for kind of setting out goals and giving us the preview into the summits. And what I'll do now is maybe ask a couple of questions of each of you, but I want to also remind the audience that if they want to ask questions, to please use the chat function, and we'll save a little time at the end if people want to add questions. But Daleep, maybe I'll start with you. And, you know, it really is remarkable the way that all of these four summits are stacked up with each other. And I just wonder, if you're stepping back, are there 2 or 3 key messages or narratives that you're hoping, you know, at the end of the summits that European allies and partners and really the rest of the world will be able to walk away with? Like, what are the key things? I get the China, climate, COVID are thematically very important, but as we're looking at the entirety of all of these really critical engagements, what are the couple of themes that you hope kind of stick?
Yeah, sure, Andrea. I'll just lift up beyond the specifics of particular issues and say, number one, I think it's going to be very important for the world to see that the G7 leaders are physically together again. It has been almost 2 years since that's happened. And beyond just being physically together, I think a key message is going to be that they are unified. And they're unified around a set of shared values and a very strong belief that our democratic way of life delivers results, and that we can meet the world's biggest challenges. And then the third item is that we're, the United States, going into these meetings from a position of strength, and that's going to allow us to rally the world's democracies around action across all of these areas. And we know we can't do this by ourselves, but whether it's global health, or whether it's the global economy, or it's thinking about how to respond to the China challenge, or whether it's talking about anti-corruption or tax issues, there are many ways in which we want to come together and develop solutions that people can understand and feel as being concrete examples of what our values mean.
Wonderful. And Amanda, you kind of mentioned talking about some of the bilateral meetings. And I think one that a lot of people are very interested in watching is the engagement with Turkey on the sidelines at the NATO summit. Turkey has obviously been a challenging partner for the United States. It's been challenging within the NATO alliance. I think many of us were watching closely in the wake of the Belarus crisis, how Turkey kind of walked back, watered down, and actually kind of removed language within the NATO context about suspending NATO cooperation with Belarus. And so as Biden is getting ready to meet with Erdogan, what is he going to say to Erdogan? Like, what are his key messages? And what are you expecting out of that engagement?
To allude to, there is a lot to be discussed between President Biden and President Erdogan on the relationship, both in terms of the bilateral relationship as well as in terms of the wider set of regional and global interests. The presidents did have a phone call at the end of April, and they agreed in that phone call that given how rich and complex the agenda was, it would make sense for them to sit down face to face on the margins of the NATO summit to have this conversation. The two leaders know each other very well. President Biden, when he was vice president, was very actively engaged on Turkey issues, including a visit to Turkey in the last months of that administration. So they will be coming into this meeting from a perspective of two leaders who know each other very well, who understand each other very well. The president is certainly going to reaffirm our desire for a constructive relationship with Turkey, ideally anchored in the Transatlantic alliance. There's a number of areas where we have shared interests, including Afghanistan, where Turkey has been an important member of the NATO operations there, Syria, where we continue to have a shared interest in bringing an end to the conflict there, to countering terrorism, to dealing with the refugee situation. And at the same time, as you alluded to, there's also areas where we have differences. The Turks are certainly going to have their list of things where they disagree with us, and President Biden is going to be raising areas where we have concerns with some of their actions. Not least being some of the democratic backsliding that we have seen in Turkey. So I really expect it to be a full and a rich conversation between the two of them that hopefully will lay the foundations for a constructive relationship between our two countries in the years ahead.
And I actually want to follow with one more question for you, Amanda, and that's kind of focusing on the European Union. You mentioned, this is the first time that we've had a summit like this since 2014. So it's been a really long time. And for a while now, NATO has been the primary focus of U.S. engagement with Europe. But obviously, by pairing it, I know the question is, is the United States signaling the importance of the EU in this engagement? Kind of how do you think about how the United States engages Europe, whether it's through NATO or the European Union? And I think one question, or kind of just to put out there, is there are still concerns within Europe. After the last 4 years of a very challenging relationship, I still think there's some lingering concerns about U.S. commitment to the relationship. You mentioned there are some kind of thorny issues that remain in the relationship. So as the president goes to Europe, and in particular to the European Union, what will his key messages be?
I thank you for that, and you're absolutely right. And it was very important to us not only to sit down and have the conversation with the NATO alliance, which remains our preeminent security organization, the place where we sit down on a day-to-day basis and talk with our Canadian friends, our European friends about our transatlantic security, but for the president also to have this opportunity to meet with the leaders of the European Union. Frankly, it's hard to think of a single issue on our agenda where we are not more effective than when we are working in close partnership with the European Union. And I think I listed off a number of the areas where we will be looking to work closely together. In the trade, the investment, the technology space, you are right that there have been irritants, but I think we have made progress in the last couple of months in terms of starting to address some of those. There's also a lot of things in the technology space that we have the opportunity now to work closely with our European friends on in terms of addressing 5G security, emerging technology, setting standards, technology regulation, and really finding a way to set the rules of the road together with our EU partners. In terms of the pandemic, we have shared interests in getting vaccines to other countries around the world, to restarting our economies, as Daleep was mentioning, and to reinforcing supply chains. So there's always also a very strong agenda there. Climate change is something where Europe really has been a leader. The United States is back in the Paris Climate Agreement, and we want to have a rich conversation with the EU about areas where we can work together on climate as well. And then there's the whole basket of foreign policy issues. Eric made reference to Belarus. This is yet another example of where the United States followed the EU in terms of very strong condemnation of what we saw in Belarus and a commitment to work in very close cooperation with the EU as we look to impose sanctions and other costs on the regime for this egregious violation of aviation standards. So I think across the board, the strong message from the United States to our European partners is we are wanting to work with you. We appreciate the ideas that you put forward. These are some of the areas on our affirmative agenda where we are looking to work in close cooperation with you. And I really believe that the opportunity for the president to sit down with his EU counterparts gives us the opportunity to take stock of where we are, to reflect on some of the progress that we have made on some of these trade and other difficult issues in our relationship, and then really to start setting a robust, positive agenda for the years ahead, where we can work together to update these rules of the road across a number of sectors, from health to the environment to technology, as well as in cooperation on all of these shared foreign policy interests.
Great, thanks, Amanda. So Eric, over to you. And I think, just channeling some of the things that you often hear in the discourse on Russia recently, including some concerns among European allies and partners, is that the United States is kind of sleepwalking, people will say, into a reset with Russia. And, people are looking, and the things that you hear is they're looking, at the much more kind of confrontational tone of the administration with China, a much more difficult meeting in Alaska, and people will juxtapose that to a much more, quote unquote, constructive engagement on the sidelines of the Arctic Council meeting. So there's all sorts of differences that are being drawn, and people now meeting, ahead of the summit, worried, concerned that we are headed in that direction. And so I just kind of put that to you to see how you respond to that.
We've said from the beginning that we are not interested in a reset, nor do we want escalation with Russia. If you think back to the era of the reset back in 2009, this is a much different Russia. We recognize that. We're clear-eyed about that. So we're going to be, again, defending our core interests, our core values. But we also have to recognize that some things haven't changed since 2009. As I mentioned, Russia still has, together with the United States, the largest nuclear arsenals on Earth. Russia is still a member of the permanent member of the Security Council and the UN. That means whether we like it or not, we have to work with Russia on certain core challenges that are out there in the world. I mentioned Syria and Afghanistan. Iran is another case where, despite all of the differences that we have, and China's in this basket too, we've worked together through a diplomatic process, to work on the Iran nuclear challenge. So we have to recognize there are areas that require some interaction and cooperation with the Russians. But we have no illusions about what's happening inside of Russia, and we don't see a lot of opportunities for real constructive engagement in a lot of areas that may have been quite different 10 or a dozen years ago.
Thanks, and I'm going to ask one more question. Amanda, I'm just going to come back to you, and then we've got several questions coming in. So Daleep, the one after that will be for you. But just to bridge this discussion with Europe and Russia, Amanda, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how the conversations on Russia are going with Europe. I think one notable thing is many have observed that the Biden administration has come in with a very serious focus on China, and have articulated that it is China that's the number one national security challenge. In Europe, it's the other way around. It really is Russia that is at the top of mind for most security challenges. And so I wonder how you might kind of thread that needle in these engagements with European allies and partners, and kind of how those issues are going to play out in these summits.
I think I would turn to Eric, I think, for some of his views. He's been having more of the Russia-focused conversations with our European partners. Certainly, I would expect that Russia is going to be a significant topic of the NATO summit. As I said, there is going to be a continued focus on the defense, the deterrence piece there. There's been a lot of concern within Europe about some of the continued aggression against Ukraine, which allies will continue to focus on. And as I mentioned, Russia is one of the many areas where we have been in lockstep with our EU partners over the last couple of months in terms of our rollout of sanctions and our efforts to ensure that our messages, as well as our measures that we are taking, are mutually reinforcing. But would turn to Eric for anything further.
Yeah, I think it's counterproductive to think about this as an either or. We have to deal with both China and Russia, and I think sophisticated audiences in Europe recognize that. And certainly the attention that we've paid to Russia in the opening months indicates that we're serious about Russia as well as about China. And again, the fact of the president meeting with our European allies and engaging on these challenges that are, in Europe, including Ukraine and Belarus and Russia's harmful hybrid activities. I hope that gives some reassurance that we are not in any way overlooking or minimizing the challenge that Russia poses to our transatlantic partners.
Great, thanks for that. Okay, I'm going to turn now to some audience questions, and I have a question that's come in from Eddie Fishman for you, Daleep. And he says that there has been a lot of discussion about reforming core international institutions, including potentially expanding the ambition and membership of the G7. Is President Biden opening to broadening the G7 to include a more regionally diverse group of like-minded democracies?
Yeah, no, thanks for the question, Eddie. I think, look, the focus for next week is coming together as a G7, and that's the entirety of the focus. We have a very large agenda to confront, and I mentioned some of the items: public health and the economy and climate change, development finance, and corruption, and we can go on with the list. But the point is, we want to come together on a set of issues as a G7 and show the world what we can accomplish. It's getting ahead of the conversation to begin discussion about other formulations.
All right, thanks. Amanda, this one's for you, coming from Ian Bond, and he's asking whether there is substantive business to be done with Boris Johnson, especially on Northern Ireland.
Hey, thanks very much for the question, Ian, and greetings to you and others in London who may be watching, and appreciate the opportunity to say a word about the Boris Johnson bilateral meeting, which is going to be the president's first engagement of this trip. And I really think it's fitting that in the first meeting of the first trip to Europe, the president has the opportunity to engage with the British Prime Minister and to have the opportunity to reaffirm the strong and enduring ties between our two countries. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson not only is the chair of the G7 this year, he's also the host of the COP26. And so I think there are great opportunities for our two countries to be aligned on the wide range of issues that Daleep outlined on the G7 agenda, as well as on the climate agenda. At the same time, there's also a lot of things for us to discuss in the bilateral relationship, including our shared approach to a large number of foreign policy challenges. You asked specifically about Northern Ireland. I would expect this is something that the two leaders will discuss. It is something that we have read out in the two phone calls that they had previously. President Biden follows events in Northern Ireland very closely, and I am sure it is something that he is going to want to continue to discuss with the Prime Minister. The president has been very clear about his desire to see continued political and economic stability in Northern Ireland, has been very clear about his desire to see the preservation of the Good Friday Agreement, to ensure that it is fully implemented in a way that works for all communities there, and have no doubt that this is a message that he will reinforce when he is in the UK.
Wonderful. Okay, I think another one coming back to you, Amanda, under fire. We have Michael and a number of people asking about NATO defense spending. And so Michael asks, will Biden seek to encourage Europe, NATO to step up its defense spending to deter Russia? Can you tell us a little bit about what that narrative is going to look like? There's with a lot of debate and discussion about how that looked under the previous administration. So how is the Biden administration approaching the issue of defense spending? And I guess I would add another question while we're on the NATO summit too, is to kind of hear from you, like, what is it that you think in the NATO context the United States is really going to get behind? Is there some signature issue that the United States is really pushing? We've had a Biden administration that's talked a lot about renewing and revitalizing American leadership. And in the NATO context, it's really important that we're pushing things in order to drive progress on that front. So if you had to say if there were one or two kind of signature issues that you think the United States really wants to accomplish, what would those be?
Thanks very much for the question. If I told you everything we were pushing and working on now, then we wouldn't have anything interesting to announce next week at the summit. So suffice it to say, we continue to be in very close cooperation with all of our NATO allies, and certainly will continue to work with them, excuse me, across the broad range of areas that I set out at the top of this, in terms of ensuring that there is a continued defense and deterrence and a continued focus on Russia, and then also ensuring this new focus on areas including China, cybersecurity, and climate. I think we're going to have a very robust communique that is coming out of this summit. We have not had a communique since the 2018 summit. And I think this is going to be a really good opportunity for the United States, in cooperation with its NATO allies, to really reaffirm our shared commitment to the alliance and our shared goals going forward. I'm pleased to excuse me, I'm talking too much here. Pleased to announce, or to reiterate, I think, what has been announced at the White House press briefing a little bit earlier today, which is that NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg is going to be here on Monday, and we'll be having a meeting with President Biden, which is going to be a great opportunity for the President and the Secretary General to start discussing and finalizing really a lot of these deliverables that we will see coming out of the NATO summit a week later. And I know that the President is looking forward to welcoming NATO Secretary Stoltenberg, who will be the first European physically in the White House, to start discussing a number of these issues. And finally, to the point on burden sharing, this is definitely something that the President remains very focused on. It's something that Secretary Austin, Secretary Blinken have both spoken to in their participations in the several ministerials that have already happened over the last couple of months. And it's also something that Secretary Blinken spoke to when he delivered a speech in Brussels on the margin of the ministerial a couple of weeks ago. Defense spending has been increasing since the 2014 NATO summit, when the Wales commitment was made at the end of the Biden and Obama administration. We're going to continue, countries certainly, to continue with very robust defense spending. And again, to have another 3Cs analogy in the NATO context, is this idea of cash contributions and capabilities. And we need to continue to have allies spending the cash to ensure that we have the necessary contributions and capabilities to ensure that NATO is fully resourced, both for its defensive activities, as well as to be prepared against some of these new and emerging threats that we are seeing. So I think this is certainly going to continue to be a priority for this administration, but we'll be able to do so, I think, in a very constructive dialogue with our NATO allies.
Thanks, Amanda. Daleep, I'm going to come to you. We have a question from Franco Ordonez that says the administration has talked a lot about conducting foreign policy from Main Street to have a clearer connection with Middle America. And his question is, how much of that philosophy will be on display during the visit? And I guess the piece I would add to that too is, what's your sense of how that kind of foreign policy for a middle class is being received by allies and partners? Do you run up against concerns that it's kind of similar in nature to an America first kind of foreign policy, or that it could be viewed as kind of protectionist or putting American interests first? So kind of to what extent will it be on display, and what's your sense of how that is being received by allies and partners?
See that it's on display and it's well received. I mean, look, the agenda that we've put forward with the G7, let's go through it. We all want to find ways to create jobs and lift wages. Everything we talk about with respect to the global economy will be directed towards sustaining the global recovery, making it inclusive, making it robust, and making sure we include a green recovery in the way in which we're building back. I mentioned before the efforts that we are likely to focus on with respect to global health. There's no other issue which is more Main Street and middle class than that all across the world. I mentioned tax. Tax is not a wonky finance issue. It's a leaders issue, because we all have an interest in raising resources to fund our domestic renewal. And for a long time, as the president's been talking about, too much of that burden has been felt on labor. Climate change is another example. You're going to see for the first time a G7 that is totally aligned on the 1.5 degree target, and there'll be commitments made over the very near term, midterm, and over the longer term to make those targets real. So look, I'll add one more to that. For those who have been feeling like the system is rigged, corruption is an issue that's a global challenge. It's a foreign policy issue that we all share in common. So here again, I think on all of these issues, there's a unified sense that we have shared interests, and we're looking to deliver concrete actions to make those real for people who don't usually pay attention to the G7.
Fantastic. Well, we're getting close to time. And since we started with Daleep with the G7, I want to end with Eric with the Putin-Biden meeting, but just to talk a little bit more on the kind of connection between Russia policy and Europe. It is my sense, and I think there's good evidence that European views on China are hardening, they're converging. Do you think it's the same on Russia? I mean, are you optimistic about our ability to coordinate with allies and partners on the Russia challenge, especially given what seems to be, just as you highlighted in your remarks, an increasingly kind of confrontational approach, not just with the United States, but with the European Union in particular? And so maybe you can say a little bit about where you see whether you see the ground converging in the wake of Navalny's poisoning, the military buildup in Ukraine, Putin's backing of Lukashenko amid all of this. Is the ground converging, and kind of where do you think we can go with allies and partners on Russia?
Yeah, I think there's always going to be differences of nuance and degree in how we approach Russia policy. That's true inside of this country, and that's true of the various countries that are in Europe. I think what we're doing is focusing on the basics to start with, and I talked about our shared values, and we've seen that exemplified with our joint actions with the Europeans on the use of chemical weapons against Alexei Navalny. We've seen that more recently on this gross violation of aviation standards. We have also been united in talking about how we talk about the increasingly narrow space for civil society and free media inside of Russia. So these are transatlantic values that Daleep and Amanda have talked about, and I think we share that with the Europeans, and we establish that as a baseline. There will be differences, as how we implement some of our policies, but so far I think we've done very well. We've been in lockstep on the sanctions on Navalny. We're working very closely on Belarus as well, and on the security side. Again, Nato has shown over and over again that it's able to respond. I think if you look at where we were in 2014 in terms of our readiness in Eastern Europe, as well as on the dollars and cents of spending. We've really come a long way on the deterrence piece. And I think there's again, unity within Europe on both that and the dialogue piece, which we're trying to take forward with this summit.
And I would just add on that, I think the president does recognize very much the concerns of countries in the eastern flank. And it's why several weeks ago he met with the B9, the Bucharest 9, which is a grouping of our eastern flank allies that often meets together, especially at head of state level, to coordinate in advance of the NATO summit. And it is specifically in recognition of those concerns and in recognition of a desire for the United States and those allies to be in lockstep that the president engaged with them in their meeting. And part of what they did discuss was this situation with Russia, where the president was able to lay out a number of these views as Eric just described.
Wonderful. Well, this was really fantastic. We laid out at the beginning that there were a lot of issues on the table and a lot of ground to cover, and I think we did just that. So I want to thank you for being so generous with your time right in the middle of what I know is just an incredibly busy time for you all. So just wishing you luck in the upcoming summits and safe travels, and we'll all be watching closely and looking forward to seeing announcements and what comes out of the summit. So thank you very much again for the preview, and we'll be following closely.